As the half-light of dawn began to spread across the eastern horizon, Walt settled himself into his prone shooting position, tucking the stock of the Remington rolling block rifle more tightly into his shoulder. Its powerful .50 caliber government cartridge would kick back like a mule if he wasn't positioned correctly to absorb its recoil. He put his eye to the full-length Malcolm telescope sight-mounted over the barrel, but the shadows were still too deep and too dark to make out the carcass in the field below. He waited patiently as the light grew slowly brighter. Looking downward from his hide in a rocky outcrop, he began to make out a dark mass against the green grass of the field. It looked larger than it had the evening before when he set up this position, and yes, it was moving. He grinned triumphantly and bent his head to the sight once more. The big brown bear was breaking its fast, ripping chunks of meat off the dead cow, eating quickly. Walt reckoned it had probably already learned the hard way that while farmers' cattle were easy prey, the farmer would express his resentment of their loss with burning powder and hot lead. Even as he watched, the bear took a last mouthful and then turned, looking up past the rocks as it prepared to climb the hill to the safety of the tree line. He took a deep breath, let it half out, and held it. "Aim low," he reminded himself. "You're shooting downhill. You got to make allowance for that." He'd already pushed forward the set trigger until it clicked, adjusting its pull weight to mere ounces. He set the sight's crosshairs on the bottom edge of the bear's body to the left of its head as it walked toward him on all fours. His finger tightened on the trigger gently, slowly, gently. The rifle boomed in the still morning air, sparks and white gunpowder smoke erupting from its muzzle. Instantly, Walt reached up with his right hand, recocked the hammer, and flicked open the breech to remove the fired case, then withdrew another fat .50-70 .450 cartridge from the box at his side and slid it into the chamber. Closing the action, he pushed the trigger forward to reset it. The whole sequence took no more than a few seconds before his eye was back at the telescope sight. The first round slammed into the top of the bear's left shoulder and raked downwards into its chest, rocking the beast's massive body. It roared aloud in pain and anger as it reared upright, standing on its hind legs, looking to see where the unexpected attack was coming from. It spotted the cloud of smoke drifting away on the light morning breeze and roared again just as Walt's second bullet smashed into its breast, piercing its heart. It bellowed once more in anguished fury as it fell forward onto all fours. It started up the hill toward him, but within a few steps its gait faltered. With a final groan, the bear toppled forward onto its snout and then slid back a few feet on the dew-wet grass. Walt reloaded and then stood up and stretched to relieve the stiffness in his joints from lying still on the cold earth for so long. At least the summer night had been relatively warm, so he wasn't too chilled. He picked up the box of bullets and slid it into his coat pocket, and then took his rifle and began to walk down the slope, being particularly careful not to slip and fall with a cocked weapon in his hands. He reached down with his right hand to loosen his revolver in its holster and remove the rawhide loop around its hammer in case he had to deliver a coup de grace to the formidable animal. Bears died hard. More than one hunter had been killed by a beast he'd thought to be safely expired. As he walked, he saw the farmer wave in triumph from his own hide at the foot of the field and started running up the slope toward him. He smiled and returned the gesture, only to frown as the farmer waved again and yet again. What on earth? He suddenly realized that the farmer wasn't waving. The man was trying to warn him. He spun around to see a second brown bear, nearly as large as the first, charging down the slope toward him. It was already no more than 30 yards away, a distance it would cover in less than 2 seconds. He didn't even try to aim through the telescope sight. The range was too short, and there wasn't time. Instead, he threw up the rifle and looked over the top of the barrel, placing the foot of the forward telescope mount in the center of the charging bear's body, as if it were a shotgun sighting bead. He squeezed the trigger, and the rifle boomed. The bear roared in pain and outrage, but Walt didn't dare wait to see where the bullet had struck. He threw himself sideways, dropping the rifle and drawing his revolver. As the bear stumbled, badly wounded, he raised the handgun and opened fire, emptying the cylinder. All 6 rounds hammered into the beast as it fell to the ground and rolled past him down the slope, almost close enough to touch. The animal roared again, scrabbling at the grass as it tried to get back to its feet, but it was too hard hit, and the wet grass was too slippery. It slid at least 20 feet past him before it stopped. From below the bear, Walt heard another rifle shot as the farmer opened fire with his Sharps carbine. The bear arched its back and squalled as the bullet struck its right rear leg, breaking the bone. As it did so, Walt dropped the empty revolver and dived for his fallen rifle. Tugging the box of ammunition from his coat pocket, he ripped it open, spilling the shells onto the grass in his haste. He grabbed one and reloaded the rifle, then spun around, lifting it. With the bear now immobilized, he could take time to aim more carefully down the barrel. His shot struck it full in the mouth as it roared in defiance, smashing out through the base of its skull. It collapsed, lying motionless on the grass. Walt reloaded once more and then stood there for a long moment, looking down at the second bear, feeling his heart pounding as if he'd just run a race against a horse. He panted for breath, feeling almost as if he was drowning, as his body demanded more oxygen than the thin Rocky Mountain air could supply. At last, his hands stopped shaking. He gathered up the spilled rifle rounds and then walked over to his revolver, picked it up, and reholstered it. The handgun had helped him prevail against outlaws in Missouri, Indians in Kansas and eastern Colorado, and horse thieves and robbers in and around Denver, but he'd never needed it more desperately than he had this morning. It was a good thing, he thought, that his rifle was breech-loading and cartridge-firing, or he'd have been left defenseless once he'd emptied the revolver. A cap-and-ball handgun took far too long to reload, and he hadn't carried a second sidearm for what he'd expected to be a simple, uncomplicated hunting trip. It was high time he considered replacing his revolvers with cartridge guns as well, although they weren't yet as common in handguns as in rifles. "I thought for sure it was going to get you," the farmer called as he hurried up the slope, puffing and panting. "You're just waving back at me instead of looking around." "Oh, I guess I didn't understand you," Walt admitted. "Where did it come from?" "It came out of the tree line behind you as you fired your second shot at the other bear. I don't know why. Grizzlies are solitary animals, but I guess that one wasn't." He gestured to the first dead bear near the carcass of the cow it had killed 2 days before. Walt shook his head. "The second one may not have been with it, but just passing through before it smelled that beef, or it might have run into hunters elsewhere. If it was wounded before, it might have worked up a real hate for men and the sound of their guns." "Yeah, maybe so. I'm thanking you for helping me take care of my problem, Mr. Ames. That was the second animal I lost this summer, but I'm thinking there won't be a third, not unless there's another big bar hanging around down Squaw Pass, and that isn't real likely at this time of year." He gestured to the mountain behind them. "Well, I'd say I should thank you for helping me, Ezra. That shot of yours broke this one's back leg." Walt indicated the wound with the barrel of his rifle. "I put 7 shots into it, but without yours it might still have had enough fight left to come back up the slope at me." "Yeah, this here Beecher's Bible may be old, but she still shoots straight and true. I'll get Lemuel to help me skin out these two, take the flesh off their hides and salt them. What do you want me to do with them?" "You keep this one. After all, you kept it off me when you broke its leg, so I'd say you earned it. I'll take the first bear's hide. I've used the furriers on 16th Street before. Take both hides to them. Tell them to charge the work to my account and ask them to make rugs out of them and turn the claws into necklaces. The second rug's yours." The farmer grinned. "Will do, Mr. Ames. Thank you. If you head down to the farmhouse, Martha will cook up some breakfast for you. Tell Lemuel to bring the wagon up here. I'll start skinning this one while I wait." The farmer produced a knife from its sheath on his belt. Walt felt saliva suddenly flood his mouth at the thought of food. "I'll do that, thanks." Walt rode his horse up the drive to the small carriage house and stable at the rear of the property. Jethro waved cheerfully at him from where he was clipping grass beneath the shade of the trees, sheltering from the early afternoon sun, and limped over as he dismounted. "Welcome back, suh. Did you get it?" "Yes, I did. And another bear besides." Walt handed him the reins. "You can rub him down and give him a ration of oats. I won't need him again today." "Yes, sah." The servant reached up and rubbed the horse's head just above his nose. The gelding snorted amiably at him. Lady, Rose's buggy horse, whickered jealously from the little paddock, envious of the attention her stablemate was receiving. Walt looked over the backyard as he walked to the house, thinking, "Well, Jethro may move slowly, but he sure does a good job of keeping things in order." The former teamster had broken his leg very badly when he'd fallen off one of Sampson's transport wagons and been run over by a wheel. It had set permanently crooked, preventing him from working a normal job, so Walt had hired him and his wife as house servants. The couple lived in a small cottage next to the carriage house. Jethro took care of the horses and grounds, which he could manage if allowed to work at his own pace, while Lily helped Rose cook and kept the house tidy. They would stay on as caretakers and look after the house when he and Rose left for Pueblo next week. He let himself in the back door, maneuvering his saddlebags and the long leather rifle case through the opening with some difficulty. Rose was in the kitchen with Lily. She turned to greet him, smiling. "Hello, darling. You're early. I wasn't expecting you till this evening. Did it go well?" He kissed her, enjoying the always welcome sight of her sparkling eyes, light brown hair, and slim, trim figure. "Well, it did, I must admit, though. When we bought that place and hired a tenant farmer to grow hay and oats for our horses and mules, I never thought shooting bears that were taken as cows would be part of my duties as a landlord." She giggled. "It's certainly not what I expected either. Still, I got you out of the freight yard for a couple of days. Now wait, you said bears? Were there more than one?" "Two of them. Second one nearly bushwhacked me, but fortunately Ezra saw him coming." "Oh, dear, are you all right?" "Well, he nearly scared the shadow right off me, but that's all. We got him, too." "You need to be more careful, darling." "Well, if the Yankees and Injuns couldn't get me, I don't figure on letting a bear take my scalp. Any letters waiting for me?" "One from our lawyer, one from Tyler Reese, your Texas friend. Have you had lunch, dear?" "No, and I'm famished. Is there something simple in the larder, like bread and cheese?" You go and wash up and read your letters. I'll have something ready in 10 minutes." Walt skimmed through Tyler's letter first. They'd met when their paths had crossed in Kansas some years before. The Texan had been driving cattle north to Nebraska, while Walt and Rose had been on their way west to Colorado Territory. Tyler had much to say about the cattle business in his state, which was helping to restore the local economy after its near collapse following the Civil War. However, he stated flatly that its success was no thanks to the policies of the Peace administration and its successor under former Union Brigadier General Davis. "I need money to expand," he wrote, "but there's no loans to be had for the likes of rebel veterans like me except at interest rates that'd beggar us. Davis' term isn't up for several years yet, and by then all the prime cattle country that's going to open up along the border with Indian Territory and in West Texas and the Panhandle may be gone. I reckon over the next couple of years, someone with the right contacts and, say, $50,000 to spend could get 20 to 30,000 acres, but unless you got the money already in hand, you'll be shut out. I've only got half that much. Once the Indians have been cleared out of that area so it's possible to raise cattle without losing your hair, the value of the land will shoot up. It's kind of opportunity that comes once in a lifetime. I feared may not come again in mine." Walt decided to write back, giving Tyler what encouragement he could. His future plans included selling horses to cattle ranches, among other buyers, so he needed to keep abreast of developments concerning them. Tyler's regular news was an important part of that. He opened the letter from their lawyer next and smiled with satisfaction at the news it contained. Rose had hastily prepared a light lunch of bread, cheese, pickles, onions, and tomatoes. She sat down at the dining room table with him and watched affectionately as he wolfed down the first mouthfuls. "You really are hungry," she observed. "Didn't Martha feed you well?" Well, she tried, but I just can't get used to her cooking. And nothing against her, you understand, but she and Ezra hail from New England. They don't cook Southern style like you and Lily. Bella, too, she observed. She's from South Carolina, which is a different style of Southern cooking, but it's still very tasty. Yes, I'm sure Samson was happy to find a woman who can feed him so well. She smiled. You did very well when you hired him back in St. Louis. Look how far he's come since then. Yes, from deck waiter on a paddle wheel riverboat to freight yard manager. It's a big jump. You were part of that, teaching him to speak, read, and write and figure better after we got here. He can stand on his own 2 feet in just about any company now. He and Bella both have come a long way from former slaves. God bless them. So what does our lawyer have to say? Well, good things. You better brace yourself. For the livery stable and its grounds, plus our hay farm outside the city, the buyers offered $17,000. $17,000? Rose's eyes widened with astonishment. But we paid less than $500 for the livery stable's land back in '66. We didn't have to pay much for the buildings. You put them up using lumber from the damaged buildings we tore down on some of the other lots you bought, so they were dirt cheap. Farm only cost us $800 just 3 years ago. That's an enormous profit. Well, it is, and it's all thanks to the railroad. After construction started in '68, prices of land and businesses began to go up again. Since it began running last year, they've almost doubled again. The business district's expanded outward until our stable's only 3 blocks away from it. The buyer doesn't want it as a livery stable. He wants the land it's standing on. It's big enough for 2 or 3 large buildings when the business district reaches it in a year or two. He bought the farmland because it was part of the deal, but he'll likely sell it separately. It's already worth 2 or 3 times what we paid for it. She laughed delightedly. I remember how worried I was when you told me a few months after we got here that you wanted to use most of our money to invest in property along the line of the railway. It hadn't even been surveyed yet. How did you know where to buy? Walt flushed. Well, I didn't tell you at the time for fear that you'd disapprove, but I used Samson as a spy master. You see, black servants and workers are everywhere. Most white men don't pay them no mind. They talk freely in front of them. I asked Samson to spread the word to his folk that I was willing to pay for information. To encourage him, I promised him 10% of everything I made from what they told me, either in cash or in a share in our business, his choice. So even before the Denver Pacific was formed, John Evans had ideas about where the city's railroad station should be. I learned about them from one of his servants, and when the panic hit in September of '66, soon after we got here, after word came that the Union Pacific wasn't going to come through Colorado but rather through Wyoming, almost half the town packed up and left for Cheyenne. Land prices were already low, and that made them collapse. I bought 8 prime lots for no more than a nickel on the dollar. All of them were near where Evans later put the railroad station or along the first half mile or so of track. I held on to the land because I knew we could live on what the livery stable brought in plus our savings. I reckoned property prices would start to rise as soon as Evans launched his plans for a connector line to Cheyenne, and I was right. For a while I thought you were crazy, she admitted, buying lots where there were no businesses to put on them. Well, you didn't say so at the time, he said, surprised. Well, you're my husband. It's my job to support you. And besides, I saw how you parlayed a couple of $1,000s in St. Louis and over $6,000 by the time we left Leavenworth City the next year. I figured if you did that well there, you might well do the same here. Well, I couldn't have done it without Samson's people and their information. That's why I gave him a quarter share of our transport business when we started it. He sure enough earned it. He's going to get a nice fat check tomorrow afternoon, too, once we complete the sale of the livery stable. With that sale, plus the last of our town lots last month, I reckon he's got over $3,000 coming. You don't think he'll take the money and set up in business for himself? Well, I've already asked him about that, and he says not. His quarter share of the freight company makes it worth his while to stick with us. Well, that's very biblical. The laborer is worthy of his reward. Yeah, I figured with a reward like that, he'll likely stay with us for a long time. If we do well, he'll do well. He'll be a big man among his people one day if he keeps on like this. I'm glad. They need leaders, and he's well equipped to be one. So after this sale, how much will we be worth? She sat forward eagerly. Well, after paying Sampson his share, we'll have over $43,000 in the bank. We also own this house, which we'll keep for when we visit Denver, plus the big transport yard I've already bought and paid for in Pueblo. We'll be taking 12 mule wagons and their teams with us, plus more than a dozen horses, and we own 24 ox wagons there, plus their teams. All in all, cash and land and wagons and stock, I reckon we'll be worth about $60,000. She sat with her mouth open for a moment as she absorbed the news. So, after just 5 years here, we're worth 10 times as much as when we arrived? She smiled at him lovingly. You know, I said back in Leavenworth City, I thought you might have a head for business, dear. She walked through to his study with him, settling into a chair as he laid his rifle on a table against the wall and prepared to clean it. Are you gonna add this morning's bear to your trophy collection? She asked, glancing up at the wall behind his desk where an impressive bighorn ram's head was mounted. Its large, broad horns, almost 40 inches along the outside of the curl, had attracted a lot of attention and admiring comments from visitors. The silver-tipped grizzly hide on the floor with its luxuriantly thick fur dated from the same hunt. The huge bear had disputed his ownership of the sheep's carcass with fatal results for the predator. The big, heavy 1859 Burden Sharps rifle Walt had used to take both trophies now rested in a display case to the right of the mounted head, along with a Henry rifle, a Springfield Model 1840 military musket cut down drastically and converted to shotgun configuration, and a pair of Remington new model Army and Navy revolvers, all of which he'd used to good effect on their journey to Colorado Territory. In a second case, to the left of the ram's head, was an old Hawken percussion-fired muzzle-loading rifle, a bullet-torn deerskin medicine bundle, a headdress with 3 eagle feathers, a tomahawk, and a sheathed knife. They were mementos from his run-in with Hunting Wolf, a young Kiowa war chief whose luck had proved unequal to Walt's skill with his guns. A second tomahawk in the place of honor at the top of the display case had been a gift from another brave, Laughing Raven, in exchange for a rifle sleeve on the same day that the war chief Satank had given Walt his Kiowa name of Brings the Lightning. Walt shook his head. That hide isn't as good as the one I've already got. I'll turn it into a rug for my office at the freight yard. Will you be able to hunt near Pueblo? I'm sure there'll be game there, although I may have to travel a bit further to reach it. I'd like to take a good elk and mount its head on the opposite wall to that ram. I wouldn't mind a buffalo head and another good grizzly in a full body mount, but they'll have to wait until we have a much bigger place. They'll be far too big for any house this size. She smiled. I suppose we'll need to build a larger house in Pueblo then. Next morning, Walt's lawyer expressed concern about his departure. You done remarkably well here in Denver, Mr. Ames. I can't understand why you're leaving at a time like this when the city is booming and everyone's making money hand over fist. You could easily double your money again in a year or two, particularly if you allied yourself with one of the larger concerns. That's the problem right there, Mr. Brown, Walt said slowly. Yes, I could go to a bigger outfit with my money and offer to become an active partner, but it'd be a junior partnership. It takes a whole lot of money to run one of the big mining or commercial businesses. $40,000 is pocket change compared to that. It'd buy me a share of a business, sure, but I'd be beholden to men with larger investments than mine. That means that they'd be in charge. I wouldn't like that. I'm used to being my own boss. Well, yes, but that's the way of things everywhere. The man with the most money calls the shots. Well, sure, but just look at the way business is done here. Miners can't get a square deal from anybody. Businesses work with each other to fix prices for goods and keep them high. Politicians are bribed and they favor the deepest pockets every time. Given a fair shake, I reckon I can hold my own against any man, but if it isn't fair, the man with the most money will buy the most influence. I can't afford to bribe politicians like that, even if I wanted to, which I don't. Well, I suppose so. I'm afraid you're right. Many of our politicians are a disgrace. Yeah, they sure are. Then there's a railroad. The Denver and Rio Grande started construction this year. It aims to hit Pueblo by next year and then go on down to El Paso. If it does, it'll open up trade all the way from here to the Mexican border. There'll be a big demand for feeder freight lines to take goods to and from the railroad to communities on either side of it. If I get in early, I can grow into one of the big shippers out of Pueblo to the mining towns around it. My money, my wagons are enough to give me a head start down there, but they aren't enough to compete with the more established shippers out of Denver. Well, I suppose you're right, the lawyer admitted. You seem to have thought this through very carefully. I've been pondering on it for a long while. There's another thing. The railroads will expand into the mountains in due course and take over a lot of the transport business. There'll still be a demand to ship freight from the new lines to smaller towns, but it won't be as big as it is now. I'll need another business, one with room to grow, so I aim to breed horses and mules. The Army will always need them, especially for their Indian campaigns, and I know how to train them for the Army because I used them for years when I wore a uniform. Cattle ranches and freight wagons will want a steady supply of them too, and anywhere from several hundred to a few thousand horses are needed every year in cities like Denver. There's good horse breeding land available within a couple of days' ride of Pueblo with good grass to make hay for winter feed. By the time the railroad expands to the bigger mining towns, I'll be selling scores, maybe hundreds of horses every year. That'll make up for any decline in the freight market. I can ship them by rail to where they're needed or drive a horse herd overland. I see. I suppose you'd rather be a big fish in a smaller pond in Pueblo than a little fish in the big pond of Denver. Yeah, that's about the size of it. Out there I'll have more of a chance of getting where I want to get, given hard work and good help. There'll be fewer problems with corrupt politicians and shady businessmen. I don't say there'll be none of them, but I reckon I'll be better able to see 'em coming and deal with 'em too if I have to. I think you'll want to have a good lawyer in Pueblo, Brown pointed out. Have you put one on retainer yet? Oh, no. Can you suggest a good man? As a matter of fact, I can. There's a young fellow named Henry Lee who just hung out his shingle there. He and my son went through law school together back east. Jim speaks highly of him. If you mention our names to him, I'm sure he'll be glad to help you. If you wish, I'll write to him to introduce you. Well, thanks, Mr. Brown. Please tell him I'll be arriving there next week, and I'll make an appointment to see him as soon as I can find the time. I'll continue to use your services for my needs in Denver, of course. Walt rose and offered his hand. The two men shook firmly. Well, best of luck to you and your wife in Pueblo then, Mr. Ames. If you need anything, you know where to find me.